Hi, this is Alex from PHP Academy and welcome to this tutorial on CSS selectors. So in this tutorial we're going to look at how we can target specific elements on our page, descendants and child elements, specific element types, class names, IDs, the list goes on. I'm not going to get too much into advanced elements. We are going to look at pseudo elements as well, things like hovering over things and stuff like that. But obviously selectors is quite a boring topic when you're looking at CSS, but really it's the backbone of CSS. You can't style anything unless you target it. So it is important that you have at least a basic understanding of how to target elements in CSS. So you can style things on your page. Obviously the key is to keep your styles and markup separate. That's what we're aiming for. We're aiming to create our markup and then move to our style sheet and style things up. So we want to keep everything as separate as possible, and therefore we need sometimes slightly more advanced ways to select specific elements. So in this tutorial we're going to be covering the basics, and then we're going to go through to some slightly more advanced things, but really we're going to cover everything you need to actually style a page. We're not going to go too much into specific attribute selectors, etc. If you're confused already with the sort of kind of language I'm using, then don't worry, this stuff's not as hard as it sounds. When we talk about pseudo elements and descendants and childs, it can sound a little confusing, but really don't worry about it. It's not too difficult at all. Right, so the first thing we're going to speak about is something that's not too difficult. It's the difference between a class and an ID. Now, you might already know this, so bear with me if you do. But let's go ahead and create an element on our page. Well, before that, I'll explain the page setup. Now, we've got an HTML tag, I guess, open with everything inside it. Similarly, we've got a head and a body. Now, all of these elements can actually be targeted by CSS as well. So they do exist in the markup, so they can be targeted. We can specify targeting HTML, head, body. Anything can be targeted in here, except things like this link here, which isn't really part of our element set. Okay, so I've got my style sheet linked in. We're working on this here. And I've also got my browser open with the index.html file that we're working on. So let's go ahead and look at the difference between a class and an ID. Okay, so if I go ahead and create any element whatsoever, so I'm going to create a paragraph element. If I was just to write some text in there. Now, this exists on my page as a paragraph, okay? It has no unique identifier about it, it doesn't belong to any group. It is just a p tag. The way I look at this is that the p tag is just a person. There's no specific category that this person fits into. It's neither male or female. So there's no identifier to it. It's just it exists as one entity. So what we can do is, if we want to assign a specific, let's say a specific generalization, but we want to, still keep it specific, like the difference between male and female, we can go ahead and do so by assigning a class. So a class will essentially be something that we can give to many objects to identify them or categorize them under the same thing, i.e. style them similarly. So I could just call the class red. Obviously it's bad practice to create a class called red to style things red, but if I was to create a class called red and I targeted this element and I wanted to say change the text color to red, the text color within this paragraph would turn red. But what I could then do is I could say a and I could create an anchor element, and I could say a link, but then I can also assign a class to this called red, and that would turn the text within the link red as well. So we are using a class to apply specific styles to a group of elements or many elements, and it doesn't matter what type of element they are, as long as that element supports that property, then we can do it. Okay, so that's a class. Now an ID. Now an ID is more or less the same thing, but we can only have one of them. It's a unique identifier. So ID, identifier. Okay, so why would we use this? Why couldn't we just use a class? Well, you could use a class, absolutely, but when we have things like div ID equals container, that's a unique element on our page. We might not need more than one container. This might be the container for our overall document, and therefore we only need one. So we target this with an ID, and that just gives us a bit more, it gives it a uniqueness, and we know that we don't need to duplicate this content. So obviously best practice that if you're creating an element like a container or a header area, I know in HTML5 we could do something like header. You could say maybe header ID equals top. Okay, so we're only ever going to have one top header, so we're only targeting one thing. It's as simple as that. Now the difference between targeting class and IDs is a whole different thing. We use different notations to target different things. So let's go back to our original example and create a paragraph. And let's go ahead and put some text in here. Okay, so we've just got a general paragraph here. Well, what do we do with it? Well, let's go ahead and assign a class to it. And I'll do the example that I did just a minute ago to keep things simple. And I'm going to say class equals red. Now inside primary.css I need to target this class by using a specific symbol, and that symbol is a dot. So whenever I have .p, and the class name, that means I've created a class called red. And then notice there's no space here. My text editor actually highlights for me that the class names are red. Funnily enough, ironically. We've got this class called red. You'll notice that I've put a curly bracket on the start and at the end. This might be useful to you if you've written any kind of language before. It can be written in one line, it can be written on multiple. You can even bring your first curly down here, but the way I use curly brackets is like this, so I'm going to keep that consistent. Okay, so I want to change the text color of anything that has the class assigned. So all I need to do is give a property and then a value. Okay, so color red. You'll see this a lot throughout the tutorial. It's not hard syntax to remember. It's property name, colon, and then the value. Obviously different properties have different values. There's restrictions, there's defaults, but we won't go into that too much. We'll just look at the selectors. So now my class of red has a color of red. So when I refresh the page, we'll see that text turn red. So we've successfully selected this class of red. Now let me go ahead and create an anchor element or a link, and we'll see what happens here. Now by default, it's got its own colors by default. The browser will render it this purple color if it's visited, which I visited a hash, and otherwise it will be blue. But if we go ahead and we assign a class to this, say red, the link will change red. Now this is obviously extremely bad practice, because every time we create a link on our page, we don't want to have to, or a paragraph on our page, we don't want to have to go and give it a class name. We're filling up our markup with unnecessary, telling, oh, I want this to be red, or I want this to be blue, or I want this to be bold. It's completely unnecessary. So there's a different type of selector that we can use for that, which we'll get to in just a moment. Let's just go ahead and look at styling a, actually I'll leave them in, styling an ID. So let's just say we had a paragraph that only existed sort of once. I'm just going to give this as an example because it's easier. So I'm going to say PID equals main. So say my main paragraph. You might not do this in practice, but it's just an example. Okay, so what we'd do is to target an ID, we would use a hash. Okay, so whenever you see a hash and then a name directly after it, you will know that's an ID selector. So like I said earlier, I used the container example, but this time I've called this paragraph main. I've given it an ID of main, so we say main here, and then I might just say font weight bold. Okay, so when I refresh, you'll see that that text has gone bold there. Okay, so that's how we select an ID. If we were to say, for example, duplicate this down, we've used the same ID twice. If we were to run this through a validator, it would validate as invalid because we've used an ID twice on the same document, which isn't allowed. We use classes for multiple gatherings of different styles, and we use a ID for a main style, like a container I used as an example. But we don't use IDs twice. It's sometimes quite difficult because when you're developing, if you have lots of different things going on, you might accidentally declare an ID twice, especially if you give them generic names like main. You might have a main menu, but then also you might have a main, a main paragraph. So, these things happen, but we don't duplicate IDs. Anyway, that's enough about the ID and the class selectors. In the next part of this, we're going to be looking at how we can target elements on their own, as opposed to just giving them a class name or an ID, if not necessary. So we'll avoid using class here for links, for example, and things like that. Okay, so that's coming up in the next part.